My name is Mia. I am 34 years old. 3 months ago, I stood on a sunlit patio at a Newport Beach country club, wearing a maternity dress and smiling for 80 guests when my father tried to erase my unborn children. He stood up from his table, tapped his silver spoon against a champagne glass, and took the microphone from the DJ. He did not look at me. He looked at the crowd, mostly his own investors and golf partners. I just want to say my father told the silent patio, his voice carrying that smug certainty I had endured my whole life, I hope it is a boy. Because if it is a girl, do not expect any inheritance. Women do not carry the legacy in this family. The patio went dead silent. A waiter holding a tray of appetizers froze in place. My husband Liam tightened his grip on my hand, his knuckles turning white. My father smiled, expecting the usual polite laughter from his peers. But I did not cry. I did not run inside. Instead, I raised my hand and signaled the caterer. 2 cannons fired into the crisp California air. A cloud of pink confetti rained down over the tables. Twin girls. As my father's smile dropped into a mask of pure disgust, I walked up to the microphone. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick, notarized document. "That works out fine, Dad," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "Because Grandpa Harrison already left $5 million in an irrevocable trust exclusively for my daughters. You do not get a single dime." Before I tell you exactly what was in that envelope and how it dismantled my father's empire in under a minute, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Orange Revenge. But do this only if you genuinely connect with my journey. Drop a comment letting me know your age and where you are watching from right now. I want to know who is here with me today. Now let me take you back to where the foundation of this lie was built, so you can understand why my father thought he could humiliate me in public and get away with it. Growing up in Orange County, the hierarchy in my house was laid out like a corporate flowchart. My father owned a lucrative commercial property management firm. He viewed wealth and masculinity as the exact same thing. My older brother Chase was the golden child. Chase was handed the keys to a new luxury car at 16. He was given the corner office at my father's firm the day he graduated college, despite finishing with barely passing grades. I was just the background noise. I paid my own way through college at UC Irvine by working night shifts. I earned my CPA license through sheer grit. I thought hard work would earn me a seat at the table. I was wrong. I remember the Sunday dinner right after I got my certification. I brought a copy of my license to the table. I offered to help audit the firm's accounts, hoping to save my father thousands in external consulting fees. My father barely glanced at the paper. He took a sip of his scotch, set his glass down, and laughed. "Numbers are a man's game, Mia," he said, waving his hand like he was brushing away a fly. "Focus on finding a good husband. Chase will handle the business. Women are just not wired for the pressure of a legacy." Chase sat across from me, cutting his steak, nodding in agreement. He did not even look up. I learned that night that fighting his sexism with tears only gave him ammunition. He would just call me emotional and dismiss me further, so I stopped trying to prove my worth to men who refused to see it. I built my own independent accounting firm. I married Liam, a high school history teacher, who saw me as an equal partner. I built a life that did not rely on my father's approval or his money. But there was one person in the family who saw the truth. One person who watched my father's arrogance and decided to do something about it. My grandfather Harrison. And the secret he shared with me during his final months of life set the trap my father would eventually walk right into. To understand how a father could stand on a sunlit patio and attempt to humiliate his own pregnant daughter in front of 80 people, you have to understand the specific architecture of my childhood. The hierarchy in our Orange County home was as rigid as the concrete foundations of the commercial properties my father managed. His firm was a sprawling enterprise that controlled strip malls, office parks, and corporate plazas across Southern California. He built a lucrative empire by demanding compliance and crushing dissent. In his mind, wealth was synonymous with masculinity. Earning money was a conquest a battlefield meant only for men. My older brother Chase was groomed from birth to inherit the throne. Chase was 2 years older than me, carrying my father's exact jawline and the same unearned swagger. He was the golden child. The disparity between us was not subtle. It was woven into our daily lives with striking clarity. On his 16th birthday, Chase woke up to a brand new luxury sedan sitting in the driveway, complete with a giant red bow on the hood. When I turned 16, my father handed me a bus schedule and suggested I look for a part-time retail job to learn the value of $1. Chase struggled through high school. He partied on weeknights and failed basic math classes. My father simply hired expensive private tutors to do his homework for him. When Chase managed to scrape together a business degree from a local university, my father threw a catered event at the country club. He handed Chase the keys to a corner office at the family firm the very next Monday. Chase had the title of Vice President of Acquisitions before he even knew how to read a balance sheet. I, on the other hand, existed as background noise. I realized very early that if I wanted a future, I had to carve it out of solid rock with my own hands. I enrolled at UC Irvine and paid my own tuition. I worked evening shifts at a diner near campus, coming home smelling like stale coffee and fried food at 2 a.m. I would sit at a small particle board desk in my cramped apartment and study accounting until the sun came up. I wanted to understand the language of money. I wanted to speak the language my father respected. During my senior year of college, I noticed a severe discrepancy in a property tax filing that Chase had casually left on the kitchen counter during a family visit. I recognized the address. It was one of the firm's largest retail plazas in Irvine. I looked at the numbers and saw an error that would have triggered an immediate and costly audit from the state franchise tax board. Chase had misclassified capital improvements as routine maintenance, a mistake that amounted to hundreds of thousands of dollars in improper deductions. I spent 3 hours correcting the ledger. I printed out the revised documents, placed them in a clean folder, and waited for my father to come home. I thought I was saving the family business. I thought he would finally look at me and see a capable partner. When my father walked through the door, I handed him the folder. I explained the error calmly. I showed him the corrected tax codes. My father stared at the papers for a long minute. His jaw tightened. He did not thank me. Instead, he threw the folder onto the granite island and glared at me. He told me to never snoop through his executive files again. He said Chase was learning the ropes, and making minor mistakes was part of the executive journey. I tried to explain the financial penalty the firm would face. He cut me off, telling me a college student had no business questioning a vice president. He took the corrected documents, handed them to his own accountant to file quietly, and never mentioned it again. Chase never even knew he made the mistake. That rejection stung, but I pushed the hurt down. I graduated and went on to earn my CPA license. The licensing exam is a grueling ordeal that breaks many candidates. I passed on my first attempt. I secured a job at a mid-tier accounting firm, gaining real-world experience auditing commercial real estate portfolios. I built a reputation for finding missing revenue and optimizing tax structures. I thought having the official credential would change the dynamic. 2 years after getting my license, I attended our usual Sunday family dinner. The dining room table was long mahogany surrounded by heavy chairs that felt like thrones. My father sat at the head, swirling his scotch. Chase sat to his right, bragging about a golf tournament. My mother sat quietly, ensuring everyone had enough food. I pulled a pristine portfolio out of my bag. Inside was a comprehensive proposal. I offered to take over the family business's internal accounting. I mapped out a strategy that would save the firm substantial external consulting fees while maximizing their asset depreciation. I slid the portfolio across the polished wood toward my father. My father did not open it. He tapped his glass against the coaster. He looked at me with a patronizing smirk that made my stomach turn. "Numbers are a man's game, Mia," he said, his voice dropping into that familiar dismissive register. "You have a nice little credential. But running a commercial portfolio requires a different kind of stamina. Focus on finding a good husband. Let the men handle the heavy lifting. Chase will handle the legacy." Chase snickered, reaching for another dinner roll. He did not bother to defend me. He agreed. I sat there looking at the man who shared my blood. I felt a hot wave of tears threatening to spill over my eyelids. I wanted to shout. I wanted to demand respect. But I knew the rules of his game. I knew that fighting his sexism with tears only validated his deeply held belief that women were too emotional to handle serious business. Crying would just be a display of weakness. It would be the proof he needed to dismiss me forever. So I forced the tears back down into my throat. I blinked, kept my face entirely neutral, and reached across the table. I took my portfolio back, placed it in my bag, and finished my meal in silence. I stopped crying that night. I stopped waiting for a seat at a table that was built to exclude me. I channeled every ounce of rejection into my career. I quit my corporate job and launched my own independent accounting firm. I rented a tiny office space in a strip mall. I started with 3 small business clients. I worked endless hours untangling messy financial histories for local vendors. Word of mouth spread. My precision became my greatest marketing tool. Within 3 years, my firm was thriving. I hired my own staff. I managed millions in assets for independent contractors across the county. My father never once asked for the name of my company. Chase referred to my business as a cute little bookkeeping hobby. I let them live in their ignorance. During this time of quiet growth, I met Liam. Liam was a stark contrast to the men in my family. He was a high school history teacher who wore tweed jackets and drove a sensible sedan. He did not care about designer watches or country club status. He cared about his students. He cared about building a life based on mutual respect. He valued partnership over dominance. When I introduced Liam to my family, my father's disappointment was palpable. During dinner, my father asked Liam about his salary expectations and career trajectory, phrasing the questions like an interrogation. Liam answered with calm confidence, explaining the fulfillment he found in education. My father just sighed, glancing at Chase with a look of shared pity. To my father, a man who did not seek aggressive financial domination was not a real man at all. Liam and I paid for our own wedding. We held a small, elegant ceremony at a local botanical garden. My father walked me down the aisle, performing the role of the proud patriarch for the cameras, but he spent the reception talking to his golf buddies. He did not offer a toast. Chase gave a brief speech that focused mostly on his own recent vacation to Cabo. I built a beautiful life with Liam. We bought a modest house. We supported each other's dreams. My firm continued to grow, securing larger accounts and expanding its reach. I had independence. I had love. I had security. But the sting of being erased from my own family's history never fully went away. There is a specific kind of grief that comes with knowing your own father views your very existence as a disappointment simply because of your gender. You can build your own empire, you can find a loving partner, but the empty space where parental validation should be still echoes. I watched my father elevate Chase, a man who consistently demonstrated incompetence, while deliberately burying my achievements. The injustice of it was a quiet, steady hum in the background of my life. I thought I was entirely alone in seeing the fraudulent foundation of my father's empire. I thought the rest of the world was blind to the toxic hierarchy that governed our family name. I believed my father and brother would continue to reap the rewards of their arrogance forever, without facing a single consequence. I was wrong. Someone else was watching. Someone who had built the very empire my father claimed as his own. The only person who saw through my father's chauvinistic facade was his own father, my grandpa Harrison, and what my grandfather decided to do about it during his final years of life would become the weapon I needed to dismantle the kingdom of men who thought I was invisible. The only person who saw through my father's chauvinistic facade was his own father. My grandfather Harrison was a man carved from a different era, a time when sweat and blistered hands commanded more respect than tailored suits and country club memberships. He started his real estate journey in the late 1970s with a single rundown retail storefront in Santa Ana. He swept the parking lots himself. He painted the facades on weekends. He built a regional empire across Southern California, not through quiet handshakes and luxury golf carts, but through calculated risks and unrelenting labor. He valued grit. He despised entitlement. Over the decades, I watched my grandfather observe the changing dynamics of his own family. He would sit at the head of our long dining table during holidays, his sharp blue eyes tracking every interaction. He saw my father interrupt my mother. He watched my brother Chase take the largest portions of food without asking, assuming his desires always superseded everyone else's needs. Harrison filed these observations away in silence. He never shouted. He never threw tantrums. He simply gathered data, treating his family with the same analytical precision he applied to his commercial acquisitions. During the last 2 years of his life, my grandfather's health began to fail. The man who used to walk active construction sites at dawn now required an oxygen tank and round-the-clock nursing staff. His heart was giving out, slowing down a machine that had run at maximum capacity for 80 years. This period exposed the stark reality of how my father and brother operated. They treated my grandfather's impending death like a slow corporate merger. Richard and Chase were far too busy taking credit for the company's success to actually visit the man who built it. They showed up at his sprawling, quiet estate in Laguna Niguel perhaps once a month. They would stay for 15 minutes, check their expensive watches, complain about traffic on the freeway, and rush back to their luxury lives. They spent their days plastering their own faces on the firm's website, actively rebranding my grandfather's lifelong effort as their own modern genius. I was the one who showed up. I became his proxy, his caretaker, and his confidant. I drove to his house every evening after finishing audits for my own independent clients. I sorted his medication organizers. I negotiated with insurance representatives. I sat by his medical bed for hours reading classic literature to him when his eyes grew too tired to focus on the pages. It was exhausting work, the invisible labor traditionally expected of daughters, while the men posed for industry magazine covers. But I cherished those quiet hours. More importantly, I managed his personal finances. We sat in his study, a room smelling of old paper and leather, while I projected spreadsheets onto a monitor for him. Despite his failing body, his intellect remained razor-sharp. During these financial reviews, we began noticing a terrifying trend in the quarterly reports generated by my father's office. Chase was leveraging stable strip malls to secure funding for flashy high-risk developments downtown. My father was authorizing these dangerous loans, betting the family farm on Chase's vanity projects. Harrison watched his life's work being gambled away by men who believed blind confidence was an acceptable substitute for actual competence. I would point out discrepancies in the cash flow statements, highlighting how my father was siphoning capital from reliable properties to cover up my brother's mounting failures. Harrison would nod slowly, tapping his cane against the hardwood floor. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Tuesday in November, 6 months before he passed away. I was balancing his medical escrow accounts when he asked me to pull up the specific deeds for the Newport Beach complex. This property was the crown jewel of his portfolio. It occupied prime coastal real estate and generated the bulk of the firm's reliable, unencumbered cash flow. It was the financial anchor keeping the rest of the company afloat amid my brother's reckless spending. Harrison stared at the digital deed on the screen. He turned his head slowly and looked at me. "Call my private estate attorney." He ordered, his voice carrying a sudden chilling clarity. "Do not call the firm's legal counsel. Call my personal lawyer. Have him here tomorrow morning, and tell no one." The next morning, the attorney arrived with a briefcase full of blank legal templates. I sat in a high-backed chair near the window. Rain lashed against the glass, casting gray shadows across the room. Harrison sat up in his medical bed. His breathing was labored, but his presence commanded the room like a judge preparing to deliver a final verdict. "Your father thinks he is inheriting the flagship Newport Beach complex," my grandfather rasped, locking his eyes onto mine. "He believes the deed will seamlessly transfer to his corporate trust the second my heart stops beating. He thinks he is going to use that revenue to fund Chase's reckless investments and bail out his own sinking ship." Harrison paused, struggling for a breath, waving away my attempt to adjust his oxygen tubing. He pointed a trembling finger toward the attorney's briefcase. "But I see how they treat you, Mia," he continued, his tone hardening with quiet fury. "I see how they treat women. They view you as a secretary. They view the women in this family as stepping stones, as pawns to be managed and discarded. I will not allow my legacy to be destroyed by arrogant boys playing at business." That afternoon, my grandfather restructured his entire estate. He did not simply leave the Newport Beach property to me directly. That would have been too simple. He knew my father. He knew Richard would tie me up in probate litigation for a decade, dragging my independent accounting firm through the mud and bleeding me dry with endless legal fees. Harrison was a master strategist. He did not build a wall. He built a fortress. Working with the attorney, he placed the Newport Beach complex into a blind, irrevocable generation, skipping trust. The legal mechanics of this maneuver were brilliant. The asset entirely bypassed the immediate next generation, legally erasing my father's claim. It also bypassed my brother. The trust was structured to sit dormant, collecting massive revenue in a shielded holding account, awaiting a specific demographic trigger. It was a lockbox that only a very specific key could open. Harrison signed the final page with a steady hand, despite his physical weakness. The lawyer sealed the documents inside a heavy manila envelope. My grandfather gestured for the lawyer to leave the room. Once we were alone, he handed the heavy parcel to me. The paper felt like a loaded weapon resting in my palms. "I am leaving this to you to manage as the sole legal trustee." "Mia," he whispered, sinking back into his pillows. "But you cannot say a word. You must swear to remain silent. You cannot tell your mother. You cannot warn your brother." I held the envelope, feeling the immense gravity of what he had just done. I promised him I would keep the secret. "Let him show you who he really is." My grandfather warned, his eyes narrowing. "Give your father enough rope. Let him construct his fragile house of cards on the assumption that he owns the solid foundation underneath it. Let him believe he has won. Because when the time comes when he tries to discard you entirely, you will know exactly what to do with this." Those words echoed in my mind for months. Grandpa Harrison passed away peacefully half a year later. The aftermath of his death was a masterclass in hypocrisy. My father staged a lavish, highly publicized funeral. He stood over the casket, weeping for the cameras, shaking hands with local politicians, and securing new investors by leveraging the sympathy of the crowd. Chase wore a tailored black suit and gave a eulogy that sounded more like a sales pitch for the firm's upcoming quarter. Neither of them shed a single genuine tear. They were too busy measuring the drapes in the executive suite. The week after the funeral, my father moved into Harrison's massive corner office. He assumed he owned everything. The firm's internal lawyers filed the standard transition paperwork, completely unaware that the flagship property generating 60% of their operating budget had vanished from their ledger. Because the trust was blind and managed by an external third-party financial institution, the revenue continued to look like it was flowing normally on the surface, masking the fact that the capital was actually funneling into the locked generation skipping account. My father started spending money he did not actually possess. He approved 3 new high-risk commercial developments for Chase to manage. He bought a vacation home in Palm Springs. He operated with the swagger of a king who had finally conquered his father's kingdom, totally oblivious to the trapdoor waiting beneath his leather shoes. I went back to my quiet life. I locked the sealed envelope in a secure safety deposit box at my local bank. I focused on expanding my own accounting firm and building a peaceful home with Liam. I watched from a distance as my father and brother paraded their unearned wealth across social media and industry banquets. I kept my promise. I remained entirely silent. I waited for the trigger my grandfather had predicted. I knew my father's toxic pride would eventually push him to make a fatal mistake regarding my place in the family. I just did not know that the catalyst for this inevitable explosion would be the discovery of my own pregnancy. The moment Liam and I decided to start a family, the dormant countdown on my grandfather's hidden legal snare began to tick faster, drawing my father's greed directly into the line of fire. For 2 years following my grandfather's death, my father ruled his commercial real estate firm like a king who had finally outlived his regent. He moved into the sprawling executive suite, replaced the vintage oak furniture with cold glass and chrome, and began orchestrating the company according to his own short-sighted vision. He treated the business as his personal treasury, a bottomless well designed to fund his luxury lifestyle and cover up my brother's mounting failures. To the untrained eye, the transition appeared seamless. The company continued to sign leases, collect rents, and manage properties across Southern California. But the foundation was missing. My father remained blissfully unaware that he did not actually own the flagship Newport Beach complex. He assumed the deed had transferred to his corporate trust the moment my grandfather passed. He never bothered to verify the chain of title. He never ordered an independent audit of his inherited assets. His ego blinded him to basic due diligence. The mechanics of my grandfather's blind trust operated flawlessly in the background. An external financial institution managed the legal ownership. The daily maintenance and tenant relations were still handled by my father's firm, creating a perfect illusion of control. The massive rental income generated by the complex flowed into the trust, which then issued an authorized annual distribution back to the firm's operating account. My father, lacking the analytical skills to separate gross revenue from restricted trust dividends, simply looked at the bottom line and assumed the money was his to spend. As long as he did not attempt to sell the building or use that specific deed as direct collateral, the illusion held firm. He was spending projected revenue based on a phantom asset. While my father and Chase played their dangerous game of corporate dress-up, I distanced myself from their world. I poured my energy into my own accounting firm, securing long-term contracts with reliable local businesses. Liam and I focused on building a sanctuary away from the toxic expectations of my bloodline. Our home was modest, filled with books, shared laughter, and quiet mornings on the patio. Liam spent his days teaching high school history, shaping young minds with patience and respect. He was the antithesis of the men I grew up with. He did not need to dominate a room to feel secure in his own skin. Everything shifted during a routine Tuesday morning in early spring. I had been feeling unusually fatigued for weeks. A visit to the doctor confirmed what we had secretly been hoping for. I was pregnant. A few weeks later, Liam and I sat in a dimly lit ultrasound room, staring at a black and white monitor. The technician squeezed cold gel onto my stomach and moved the wand with practiced efficiency. We waited in breathless silence. Suddenly, the screen flickered, revealing two distinct, rapid heartbeats echoing through the small room like a pair of galloping horses, twins. Liam squeezed my hand so tightly I could feel the pulse in his fingers. Tears of profound joy streamed down his face. We laughed out loud, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the moment. We were going to be parents to two tiny human beings. The protective instinct hit me with the force of a tidal wave. I promised right then, looking at those flickering shapes on the monitor, that I would never allow my children to feel the cold, conditional love that had defined my own childhood. We kept the news to ourselves for a month, guarding it like a precious secret. Eventually, the time came to share the development with my family. My father had summoned us for one of his mandatory Sunday dinners at his estate. These dinners were never about family bonding. They were stage plays designed to reinforce the hierarchy. We arrived at his sprawling house in the hills, stepping into a dining room that felt more like a corporate boardroom. The table was set with heavy silver and dark linens. My mother hovered in the background, ensuring the wine glasses were full, and the prime rib was served at the exact right temperature. She had spent 40 years shrinking herself to accommodate my father's temper, and tonight was no different. My father sat at the head of the table, cutting his steak with deliberate, forceful movements. Chase sat to his right, loudly detailing a recent negotiation where he had supposedly outsmarted a rival developer. The story was full of holes highlighting Chase's fundamental misunderstanding of zoning laws, but my father nodded along, praising his aggressive tactics. Liam and I exchanged a brief glance across the table. I gave him a small nod. It was time. I waited for a lull in Chase's monologue. I set my fork down and cleared my throat. Liam and I have some news, I said, keeping my voice steady. We went to the doctor recently. I am pregnant. We are having twins. For a brief, naive second, I expected the normal reaction. I expected surprise congratulations, maybe even a genuine smile from the man who gave me life. I thought the prospect of new grandchildren might temporarily pierce his armor of chauvinism. Instead, a heavy, calculating silence fell over the dining room. My mother gasped softly, a brief flicker of joy lighting her eyes before she quickly looked to my father, waiting for her emotional cue. My father did not smile. He placed his knife and fork on the edge of his plate. He picked up his linen napkin, wiped his mouth, and narrowed his eyes. He looked past me, fixing his gaze on Chase. His mind was already treating my unborn children as variables in a corporate equation. Twins. My father mused, his voice devoid of any warmth. He swirled the red wine in his glass, watching the liquid coat the crystal. Well, if Mia has a boy, we might have to rethink the board structure. A male grandson carries the bloodline. We would need to set up a legacy trust to ensure he gets a proper seat at the table when he comes of age. He paused, taking a slow sip of his wine. He let the silence stretch before delivering the rest of his thought. If they are girls, my father continued, shrugging his shoulders as if discussing a bad real estate investment, Well, they will just marry out of the name anyway. No real equity there. The air in the room turned to ice. My breath caught in my throat. I felt Liam shift abruptly in his chair. Under the table, Liam's leg pressed against mine tight with barely contained fury. He opened his mouth to speak, ready to tear my father apart for stripping the humanity from our children before they were even born. I quickly placed my hand over Liam's knee and squeezed hard, silently begging him to hold his tongue. A confrontation here would only give my father the fight he craved. Before the tension could break, Chase leaned back in his chair and laughed. It was a cruel, dismissive sound that echoed off the high ceiling. "Do not worry, Dad," Chase said, reaching across the table to grab another piece of meat. "If she has girls, they can always work reception at the firm. We always need someone to answer the phones." My father chuckled a dry, grating sound, nodding his head in agreement. I sat there staring at the two men who shared my DNA. The expensive steak on my plate looked like ash. The room felt suffocating. They were so blinded by their own arrogance, so deeply entrenched in their misogyny, that they did not even view my unborn children as living, breathing human beings. To my father and brother, these two tiny lives were nothing more than potential assets or liabilities to their bloated egos. A boy was a legacy. A girl was a secretary. I looked at my mother. She was staring down at her lap, refusing to meet my eyes. She had heard these same insults for decades and had chosen compliance over protection. She was not going to defend her grandchildren any more than she had defended her daughter. In that moment, a profound and chilling clarity washed over me. The pain of rejection vanished, replaced by a cold, calculated resolve. This was no longer about my wounded pride. This was no longer about a daughter wishing her father would respect her accounting degree. This was about survival. If I gave birth to daughters, my father would not just ignore them. He would actively diminish them. He would use his wealth and influence to ensure they felt the same suffocating inadequacy he had forced upon me. He would parade Chase's future children around as the true heirs, turning family gatherings into toxic battlegrounds designed to break my daughter's spirits. I finished my glass of water, placed my napkin on the table, and stood up. I thanked my mother for the meal. I told them we had an early morning and needed to get home. Liam stood up beside me, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle ticked near his ear. We walked out of the house without waiting for a reply. The drive home was silent. Liam gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white in the glow of the dashboard lights. When we finally pulled into our driveway, he turned the car off and looked at me, his eyes burning with protective rage. He told me we never had to go back there again. He told me he would never let those men near our children. I unbuckled my seatbelt and touched his face. I promised him our children would be safe. I knew something he did not. I knew about the sealed envelope locked inside my safety deposit box. My father's reaction at the dinner table was not just an insult. It was a declaration of war. By openly stating his intention to manipulate the family assets based on gender, he confirmed every warning my grandfather had given me. My father was already plotting how to control the narrative and the capital. He did not just want to sideline my children. He wanted to ensure they had zero access to the generational wealth he believed he controlled. The very next week, I began noticing strange movements in the periphery of my life. My father was not going to wait for the birth to start executing his strategy. He began making deliberate, calculated moves to financially isolate me, testing the waters to see how much power he could wield over my future. He was preparing to systematically sever my ties to the family resources, pushing the conflict from cruel words into actual financial sabotage. As my pregnancy advanced into the second trimester, the physical reality of carrying twins demanded my focus. My days were measured in prenatal appointments, dietary adjustments, and the steady, rhythmic kicks against my ribs. While my body worked to create new life, my father and my brother were busy working in the shadows to stifle our future. They did not announce their maneuvers. They operated with the quiet, calculated stealth of men who believed they were untouchable. But I am a certified public accountant. My entire career is built on reading the silent stories that numbers tell. Money leaves a trail, and the money in my family had begun to run. The first sign of financial sabotage arrived in the mail. For years, I had received a routine tax document for a minor holding company my grandfather had established when Chase and I were children. It was a modest fund generating a small annual distribution that I usually rolled into my savings account. When the envelope arrived that spring, I opened it at my kitchen counter and scanned the figures. The distributions had vanished. The ownership percentages had shifted overnight. Chase was now listed as the primary managing partner, absorbing my shares through a hidden corporate loophole my father had authorized. I set the paper down on the granite counter. This was not a clerical error. It was a test. My father was draining the periphery of the family wealth, drawing a financial moat around his castle. He wanted to see if I would call him, if I would beg for the scraps he had taken from me. Over the next few weeks, the paper trail grew longer. I retained read-only access to a shared digital portal for a family trust that held several residential properties. I logged in one evening and watched in real time as liquid cash was transferred out of high-yield savings accounts and funneled directly into an offshore LLC controlled entirely by Chase. My brother was simultaneously posting photos on social media from a luxury ski resort in Aspen, showcasing a new vacation property he had just acquired. He was liquidating shared family assets to fund his extravagant lifestyle, fully sanctioned by our father. My father was methodically isolating me. He intended to ensure that if my children were girls, we would lack the resources to challenge his decisions. He wanted to starve me out. He believed that by cutting off my access to generational capital, he could force me into a state of dependence. In his patriarchal worldview, a woman without financial backing was a woman who had to fall in line. He expected me to eventually return to his firm with my hand outstretched, asking for a favor, validating his belief that he was the supreme provider. Liam watched me review the altered tax forms one evening. He sat across the table grading history essays with a red pen. He did not care about the lost capital. Liam grew up in a working-class neighborhood in San Diego and built his life on principles that could not be deposited in a bank. He looked at the paperwork, then looked at me, his jaw setting into a hard line. "He is trying to make you feel small," Liam said, his voice carrying a quiet, steady anger. "He thinks his bank account makes him a giant. He does not understand that you are already out of his reach." Liam was right. I did not need their money. My independent firm was thriving, bringing in more than enough revenue to support our growing family. We had a secure mortgage and a solid retirement plan. The sting did not come from the loss of funds. It came from the profound disrespect. It came from watching the men who shared my blood systematically attempt to erase my unborn children before they even took their first breaths. The full scope of their betrayal was confirmed on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my home office finishing a quarterly tax projection for a client when my cell phone buzzed. The caller ID showed my mother's name. My mother rarely called me during business hours. She spent her days managing the household staff, attending luncheons at the Newport Beach Country Club, and maintaining the flawless facade my father demanded. When I answered the phone, I heard the distinct hollow echo of a tiled bathroom. She was hiding. "Mia," my mother whispered. Her breath rushed and uneven. "Are you alone? I am in my office, Mom. What is going on?" She paused, listening for footsteps on the other end of the line. My mother had spent 40 years shrinking herself to fit into the narrow space my father permitted. She traded her voice for financial security long before I was born. She never contradicted him in public. She rarely disagreed with him in private. The sound of her terrified whispering sent a chill down my spine. "I was in your father's study looking for a stamp." She stammered the words, spilling out in a panicked rush. He left a file open on his desk. It was a communication with his estate lawyers. "Mia," he altered the primary trust documents. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. "What did he do?" "He removed you from the residual beneficiary list," she confessed, her voice cracking. In estate planning, the residual beneficiary list is the ultimate safety net. It is the bucket where all remaining unallocated assets pour after specific bequests are settled. By removing my name from that specific clause, my father was legally declaring that my bloodline was worth nothing to the family tree. He was ensuring that every remaining property, every stock portfolio, every liquid asset would default exclusively to Chase. "He just wants to ensure the capital stays with Chase," my mother pleaded, trying to justify a cruelty she lacked the courage to fight. "He says since you are married to a teacher, you wouldn't know how to handle real wealth. He thinks Liam lacks the instinct to manage a corporate portfolio." I closed my eyes. The insult was so predictable, yet it still carried a sharp sting. My father equated a teacher's salary with intellectual deficiency. He viewed Liam's dedication to public education as a character flaw. He could not comprehend a man who measured success in the lives he improved rather than the competitors he crushed. "Please, Mia," my mother begged, her whisper growing more frantic. "Just do not make a fuss. Let him have this victory. Do not start a war with him right now. It is his money. He built the company. Let him do what he wants." I opened my eyes. I looked down at the corner of my mahogany desk. Resting near my keyboard was a thick, heavy manila envelope. It was the package Grandpa Harrison's private estate attorney had hand-delivered to my house that very morning. The wax seal was unbroken. Inside that envelope was the deed to the flagship Newport Beach complex, the irrevocable generations skipping trust that my father knew nothing about. My mother was asking me to bow my head. She was asking me to accept my own erasure to spare her the discomfort of my father's temper. She wanted me to surrender my daughter's dignity to maintain her country club illusion. I picked up the heavy envelope, feeling the weight of my grandfather's foresight resting in my palms. "It is not his money, Mom," I replied, my voice dropping into a calm, frigid register. "He did not build that company. Grandpa built it. Dad is just spending the profits." "Mia, please," she whimpered, "and I will not make a fuss." I continued tracing the edge of the envelope with my index finger. "I will make a boundary. You tell Dad he does not need to worry about my finances. Liam and I are perfectly fine." I hung up the phone before she could say another word. I sat in the quiet of my office, the sunlight filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. My father was intentionally trying to financially isolate me before the babies were born. He wanted to force me into a corner. He wanted to prove that his patriarchal worldview was correct, that a woman without a dominant male provider was destined to fail. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess. He believed he had quietly captured all my pieces while I was distracted by my pregnancy. But my father was not a strategist. He was a bully with a checkbook. He had spent his entire life bullying people who could not fight back, and he assumed I was just another subordinate waiting for his instruction. His silent financial maneuvering was not enough for him. A bully requires an audience. Removing me from a hidden trust document satisfied his greed, but it did not satisfy his ego. He needed a public stage to crown Chase and formally display his dominance. He needed a venue where his peers could witness him dictating the terms of the family legacy. 2 days after my mother's frantic phone call, my father contacted me. He did not sound angry. He sounded entirely magnanimous, playing the role of the benevolent patriarch. "Mia," his voice boomed through the receiver, dripping with false warmth. "Your mother tells me you are planning a baby shower for next month. I will not have my daughter hosting a gathering in a cramped backyard. I have spoken to the events coordinator at the Newport Beach Country Club. I am booking the main patio. I will cover the entire cost." I listened to him speak, recognizing the trap immediately. He did not want to celebrate my children. He wanted to hijack the event. He knew his investors and corporate partners would be in town that weekend for an annual charity gala. Hosting my shower at his country club allowed him to invite his own guest list. It provided him with a captive audience of affluent peers. He intended to use the gathering to publicly assert his control over the family narrative, solidifying Chase as the sole heir in front of the people who mattered to his business. He expected me to be grateful. He expected me to thank him for his generosity, cementing my role as the dependent, submissive daughter. I looked down at the manila envelope on my desk. The generation skipping trust required a specific trigger. It required proof of female heirs, and it required a public venue to execute the transfer of power. My father was handing me the exact stage I needed to drop the guillotine. "Thank you, Dad," I said, allowing a soft, compliant tone into my voice. "The country club patio sounds perfect. We will see you there." The invitations arrived 2 weeks before the event. They were printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock with embossed gold lettering. My father had not consulted me on the design. He had simply outsourced the task to his corporate marketing department. When Liam brought the stack of envelopes into our kitchen and dropped them onto the counter, he let out a low, bitter laugh. I picked up one of the invitations and read the text. It did not invite guests to celebrate the impending birth of our children. It formally requested their presence at a springtime reception hosted by the managing director of the firm. My name and Liam's name were printed at the very bottom, treated as secondary details like footnotes on a legal contract. Liam wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder, as we stared at the guest list my father had attached. It was a masterclass in corporate posturing. My closest friends and Liam's fellow teachers were vastly outnumbered. The list was packed with commercial real estate developers, regional banking executives, municipal zoning board members, and my father's golf partners. My father was not throwing a baby shower. He was hosting a shareholder meeting with pastel decorations. He was paying for the venue at the Newport Beach Country Club because he required a theater. He needed a pristine, highly visible stage to project his authority. By surrounding himself with affluent peers, he intended to publicly relegate me to the role of the dependent daughter while elevating my brother Chase as the undisputed heir to the family throne. He wanted to look his investors in the eye and signal that the company's future rested safely in male hands. He wanted everyone to know that my children, regardless of their gender, were irrelevant to the business hierarchy. I placed the invitation back on the counter. I did not feel the sting of rejection anymore. I only felt a cold, calculating anticipation. My father had spent thousands of dollars to gather the most important people in his professional orbit into one room. He had assembled the exact audience I needed to dismantle his entire charade. The Tuesday before the shower, I took a morning off from my accounting firm. I drove to a sleek glass and steel high-rise in downtown Irvine. I took the elevator to the top floor and walked into the private law offices of Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis was a seasoned estate attorney who had managed my grandfather Harrison's personal affairs for over 3 decades. He was a man of few words, possessing a sharp intellect and an unwavering loyalty to my grandfather's true wishes. When I sat down in the leather chair across from his mahogany desk, he did not offer superficial pleasantries. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the heavy manila envelope my grandfather had entrusted to me years ago. We had broken the wax seal a week prior to verify the contents, but today was the day we executed the legal mechanics. The medical records confirming you are carrying twin females have been verified and processed. Mr. Davis stated, sliding a stack of bound documents across the desk. The conditions established by your grandfather have been met in full. We are ready to unseal the trust and activate your status as the sole legal trustee. I opened the binder. As a certified public accountant, I spend my life reading financial structures. I look for vulnerabilities, loopholes, and liabilities. But as I read through the parameters of the generation skipping trust my grandfather had constructed, I felt a profound sense of awe. It was a masterpiece of legal engineering. It was a fortress. The primary asset held within the trust was the flagship Newport Beach complex. This property was a sprawling, high-end retail and commercial hub located on prime coastal real estate. It boasted a 0% vacancy rate. The tenants included national banking branches, luxury boutiques, and corporate offices locked into ironclad 10-year leases. I looked at the revenue projections. The Newport Beach complex was not just a building. It was the financial anchor of my father's entire operation. It generated 60% of the firm's reliable, unencumbered operating revenue, and my father did not own it. He had never owned it. When my grandfather passed away, the deed to the Newport property did not transfer to my father's corporate portfolio. Grandpa Harrison had quietly severed it from the main holding company and placed it into this blind, irrevocable trust. I looked up at Mr. Davis, tracing the lines of the contract with my pen. How did my father not notice the deed was missing from his inheritance, I asked. Mr. Davis offered a thin, knowing smile. Your father is a man who looks at the cash flow, not the paperwork. The trust was structured so that your father's firm would continue to act as the property management company. They collected the tenant rent, took a standard 5% management fee, and remitted the remaining net profit to the holding account. It made perfect sense. My father assumed the holding account was just another subsidiary under his control. He never audited his own inheritance. He was so blinded by his ego, so eager to sit in the big chair and play the boss, that he never performed basic due diligence on the assets he claimed to own. He had been spending projected revenue based on a phantom foundation. But the brilliance of my grandfather's trap went deeper than the real estate deed. I turned to the next page of the ledger. Over the years since my grandfather's death, The trust had been accumulating the net profits from the Newport complex. Because the trust was dormant waiting for a triggering event, the money had simply piled up in a high-yield escrow account. I stared at the bottom line, $5 million in liquid dividends. The conditions of the trust were very specific, Mr. Davis explained, pointing to a highlighted clause in the document. Your grandfather anticipated that your father would try to financially isolate you. He knew Richard would try to cut any female descendants out of the family wealth. So he mandated that this trust would only activate upon the birth of a female great-grandchild. I read the text carefully. The stipulations were bulletproof. If Chase had a son, the trust remained locked. If I had a son, the trust remained locked. If my grandfather's lineage produced only male heirs, the entire $5 million and the Newport Beach property would be liquidated and donated anonymously to a predetermined list of charities. Grandpa Harrison had created the ultimate test of character. He purposefully weaponized his wealth to protect the exact demographic my father despised. By having twin girls, I was not just bringing new life into the world. I was turning the key in a lock that secured my daughter's future, while simultaneously pulling the rug out from under my father's fraudulent empire. Now that the female heirs are confirmed, Mr. Davis continued handing me a sleek metal pen. The property and the $5 million belong entirely to your daughters. As their mother, you are named as the sole legal trustee. You control the asset. You control the capital. Your father has zero legal claim, and neither does your brother. I signed my name on the dotted line. The ink flowed smoothly across the paper. With each stroke of the pen, I reclaimed the dignity my father had tried to steal from me. But as I reviewed the final asset transfer protocols, a chilling realization washed over me. I looked at the property management history provided by the trust. My father had not just been collecting his 5% management fee. In his arrogance, assuming he owned the building outright, he had been using the Newport Beach complex as collateral to secure massive commercial loans for Chase's reckless downtown developments. He had leveraged a building he did not own to borrow millions of dollars from institutional lenders. Mr. Davis, I said, looking up from the ledger, my heart beating with a steady drum-like rhythm. If I take formal possession of this trust today, the holding account will sever all ties with my father's firm. The management contract will be nullified. That is correct, the attorney confirmed. And when the lenders run their routine quarterly audits and realize my father pledged an asset he does not hold the title to, they will issue an immediate call on those loans. They will trigger a default. Mr. Davis said, leaning back in his chair. Your father's firm will face a catastrophic liquidity crisis. The house of cards will collapse. I sat in the quiet office, the gravity of the situation settling over my shoulders. My father had spent his entire life building a kingdom on a foundation of misogyny and unearned pride. He had openly mocked my accounting degree. He had told me numbers were a man's game. He had tried to strip my unborn daughters of their rightful place in our family history simply because they were girls. He thought he was untouchable. He thought his wealth shielded him from accountability. I gathered the signed documents, placed them securely into my leather portfolio, and stood up. I shook the attorney's hand. I walked out of the high-rise building and stepped into the warm California sun. I felt lighter than I had in years. I was no longer the invisible daughter hoping for a seat at the table. I owned the table. 4 days later, the morning of the baby shower arrived. The weather was flawless, a crisp, cloudless Sunday in Southern California. Liam helped me load the car. I wore a flowing, emerald green maternity dress that caught the ocean breeze. I felt strong. I felt ready. Before we left the house, I carefully placed the thick, notarized trust document into my woven maternity bag, tucking it safely beside a stack of thank you cards. We drove up the winding, palm-lined driveway of the Newport Beach Country Club. The venue was pristine. Valets in crisp white shirts opened luxury vehicles for arriving guests. I could hear the faint sound of a string quartet playing on the back terrace. When Liam and I walked through the double doors and stepped out onto the sunlit patio, the scene was exactly as I had predicted. The space was littered with towering floral arrangements in neutral tones. Waiters carrying silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres navigated through a crowd of men wearing tailored suits and expensive watches. It did not look like a celebration of new life. It looked like a corporate networking event. My father was standing near a massive ice sculpture at the center of the patio, holding a glass of champagne. He was surrounded by his primary investors and a team of corporate lawyers. He was holding court, laughing loudly, commanding the attention of the room. Chase stood right beside him, nodding along, playing the role of the loyal lieutenant waiting for his promotion. They did not rush over to greet me. They did not ask how I was feeling. They barely acknowledged Liam's presence. They simply gave a passing wave, continuing their business discussions, as if we were hired entertainment. I smiled, linking my arm through Liam's. We spent the next hour speaking with my genuine friends, accepting their warm wishes, and enjoying the ocean view. I watched my father work the crowd out of the corner of my eye. I watched him posture. I watched him soak in the admiration of his peers, entirely ignorant of the document resting inside my bag. Then the string quartet stopped playing. The low hum of conversation began to fade as my father signaled the DJ to cut the background music. He stepped forward, walking toward the center of the patio. He grabbed a microphone from the stand, tapping his silver spoon against his champagne glass to demand absolute silence. The crowd turned their attention to the patriarch. The trap was fully set. My father took a deep breath, puffed out his chest, and prepared to deliver a speech that would change the trajectory of our family forever. Okay, let me pause here for a second. If you have ever sat silently while a toxic family member tried to belittle your worth, drop a yes in the comments. And if you are ready to see this arrogant man lose his empire, hit that subscribe button. Now back to the patio. The feedback from the microphone emitted a high, sharp whine, echoing across the manicured lawns of the country club. My father stood near the center of the terrace, holding the sound equipment loosely in one hand and his crystal champagne flute in the other. He wore a tailored navy suit, presenting himself as the undisputed king of his domain. He had just declared into a live speaker that female children held zero value to our family legacy. He waited for the validation he was accustomed to receiving. He expected his investors, his golf partners, and his sycophantic board members to chuckle, raise their glasses, and agree with his archaic worldview. Instead, a heavy, suffocating quiet descended upon the 80 guests. The ocean breeze rolling off the Pacific seemed to freeze in place. A waiter balancing a silver tray of bacon-wrapped scallops stopped mid-stride, staring at the ground. Several wives of the corporate executives shifted uncomfortably in their pastel sundresses, casting nervous glances at their husbands. The men in the crowd, business leaders, who usually hung on my father's every word, simply cleared their throats and avoided making eye contact. Even in their ruthless corporate circles, brazenly disowning unborn grandchildren on a sunny Sunday afternoon, crossed an unspoken line. Liam tightened his grip on my hand. I could feel the heat radiating from his palm. His knuckles were bone white. He stepped forward, putting his shoulder slightly in front of mine, ready to defend me. I brushed my thumb across his knuckles silently, telling him to hold his ground. I did not need a shield today. I had brought my own weapon. I looked at the catering manager standing near the buffet tables. He was a young man wearing a crisp white shirt and a black vest. We had coordinated the timing earlier that morning. I gave him a single definitive nod. He pressed a button on a remote control hidden in his palm. Two loud pops shattered the uncomfortable silence. Compressed air cannons positioned strategically at the corners of the patio fired into the clear California sky. A massive swirling cloud of brightly colored paper shot upward, catching the afternoon sunlight. Thousands of vibrant pink confetti strips rained down over the terrace. The paper fluttered onto the white linen tablecloths. It drifted into the expensive champagne flutes. It landed on the shoulders of the elite businessmen and caught in the elaborate hairstyles of their wives. The entire venue was suddenly saturated in the exact color my father despised. Twin girls. The visual contrast was striking, a shower of soft, joyful pink blanketing a crowd of tense, silent adults. I turned my attention back to the man holding the microphone. The smug, self-satisfied grin had vanished from my father's face. His features contorted into a rigid mask of pure, unfiltered disgust. The realization that his bloodline would not be carried forward by a male heir hit him physically. His chest deflated. The color rushed to his cheeks, turning his skin a dark mottled red. Standing a few feet away from him, my brother Chase reacted with equal predictability. Chase brushed a pink paper streamer off his lapel as if it were a venomous insect. He scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes, shaking his head in mock pity. In their minds, my pregnancy had just been downgraded from a potential corporate asset to a useless biological event. Near the ice sculpture, my mother pressed both hands over her mouth. Her eyes were wide, brimming with a complicated mixture of genuine joy for her daughter and immediate paralyzing fear of her husband's impending wrath. She took a half-step toward me, wanting to celebrate, but quickly retreated, shrinking back into the shadows of the floral arrangements. She chose her own safety over my milestone. My father handed the microphone to a passing busboy without looking at him. He set his champagne glass down on a cocktail table with enough force to crack the stem. He squared his shoulders and began marching across the stone pavers directly toward me. He did not care about the guests watching him. He did not care about the optics of ruining a celebration. The facade of the benevolent patriarch was gone, replaced by the ruthless dictator who felt his authority slipping. The crowd parted instinctively, stepping back to give him a wide berth. He stopped 2 feet in front of Liam and me. He leaned in, invading my personal space, his breathing shallow and rapid. "What is this nonsense, Mia?" he snapped. His voice was a harsh, venomous whisper intended only for my ears, but the sheer venom in his tone carried a palpable weight. "You think parading this pink garbage around means anything? You think making a public spectacle changes the fact that Chase is inheriting the company?" He pointed a thick finger at my stomach. "You just sealed your own fate. Those girls will never see a dime of my money." I stood my ground. For 3 decades, my instinct in these moments had always been to lower my gaze, to apologize for taking up space, to shrink myself to fit his narrative. I used to tremble when his voice took on that sharp cutting edge. But today, standing under a shower of pink confetti, carrying 2 lives inside me, I felt an impenetrable calm. His anger was no longer a threat. It was the frantic flailing of a man who did not realize the ground beneath him had already vanished. "I do not need to change anything, Dad," I said. My voice was level, measured, and stripped of all emotion. I spoke with the clinical detachment of a certified public accountant finalizing an audit. I reached into my woven maternity bag. My fingers bypassed the stack of thank you cards and closed around the thick manila envelope. The paper felt solid, weighted with my grandfather's final binding wish. I pulled the envelope out into the sunlight. I did not hand the documents to my father. Handing them to him would have been a waste of time. He would have refused to read them. He would have called them forged, torn them in half, and thrown the pieces into the nearby decorative fountain. He lacked the legal comprehension to understand the trap anyway. Instead, I shifted my gaze past his shoulder. Standing near the buffet table, holding a small plate of appetizers, was Martin. Martin was the lead corporate counsel for my father's property management firm. He was a sharp, calculating attorney who had spent 15 years drafting my father's contracts, exploiting zoning loopholes, and structuring the very trusts that intentionally excluded me from the family wealth. Martin was the architect of my father's financial illusion. He was a man who understood liability asset transfer and undeniable legal proof. I stepped around my father, ignoring his presence entirely, and walked directly toward the lawyer. The guests watched my every move. The tension on the patio was thick enough to choke on. Liam followed close behind me, matching my pace, his presence a silent guard against any sudden interference from Chase. "Martin," I called out, my voice ringing clear across the terrace. The attorney stopped chewing. He lowered his plate, eyeing me with suspicion. He knew my father despised me, which meant Martin was professionally obligated to treat me as a hostile entity. "Please review this," I said, extending the heavy envelope toward his chest. "As the fiduciary representative of the firm, you need to authenticate these papers immediately. The future of your operating budget depends on it." Martin hesitated. He shot a nervous, questioning glance at my father, waiting for permission. My father scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest, projecting supreme confidence. "Read it, Martin." My father ordered, an arrogant smirk returning to his lips. "Let us see what kind of forged, desperate accounting tricks my daughter printed off the internet." Martin set his plate down on the white linen table. He wiped his hands meticulously on a cloth napkin. He reached out and took the envelope from my hands. He broke the clasp, pulled out the thick stack of bound legal documents, and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. The patio remained frozen in silence. The only sounds were the distant crashing of ocean waves and the rustle of heavy, high-grade legal paper as Martin flipped open the cover. He read the first page. It contained the title of the document and the overarching mandate of the Generation Skipping Trust. He read the second page. It detailed the specific asset held within the trust boundaries, clearly identifying the flagship Newport Beach complex by its municipal parcel number and legal description. He read the third page. It outlined the activation trigger, explicitly citing the confirmed gestation of female heirs, and listed my name, Mia, as the sole irrevocable legal trustee. I watched Martin's face with intense fascination. He was a professional paid to maintain a stoic, unreadable demeanor during high-stakes negotiations. But as his eyes tracked across the paragraphs, his professional mask shattered. The color drained from his cheeks, rushing away and leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw slackened. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. He understood exactly what he was looking at. He recognized the undeniable signature of my grandfather Harrison. He saw the raised, embossed seal of the state notary. He processed the flawless, impenetrable legal structure drafted by a rival estate attorney who was far more skilled than he was. Martin realized in a matter of seconds that the building generating 60% of their company's revenue did not belong to his boss. He realized that every commercial loan he had helped my father secure using that property as collateral was now in immediate catastrophic default. The lawyer's hands began to shake violently. The papers rattled against each other. He took a physical step backward, his heel bumping hard into the edge of the buffet table. The impact sent a stack of dessert plates clattering onto the stone pavers, shattering into pieces. Martin lowered the documents. He did not look at me. He slowly turned his head, his eyes wide with a profound, career-ending panic, and stared directly at my father. The shattered fragments of the dessert plate lay scattered across the stone pavers, glistening in the afternoon sunlight. Martin stared at the heavy legal paper in his hands, his breathing shallow and erratic. He looked like a man who had just watched a bridge collapse directly in front of his car. He did not care about the broken porcelain at his feet. He did not care about the 80 guests holding their breath, waiting for an explanation. He slowly lifted his gaze to my father. Richard, the attorney, whispered, his voice trembling so badly it barely carried over the sound of the nearby decorative fountain. "Richard, she is not lying." My father stood frozen. The dark flush that had crawled up his neck suddenly stalled. He tilted his head, his brow furrowing as if Martin had just spoken to him in a foreign language. "What are you talking about?" my father snapped, reaching out and snatching the documents from the lawyer's hands. "Stop shaking, Martin. It is a fabricated document. She printed it out to cause a scene." "The notary seal is registered by the state," Martin replied, stepping back and running a hand over his thinning hair. "The signature belongs to your father. The executing firm is Davis & Associates. Richard, the Newport Beach complex, your father never transferred the deed to your holding company. He put it in a generation skipping trust for Mia's female heirs." My father stared down at the paper. His eyes tracked across the paragraphs, but I could tell his brain was rejecting the information. A narcissist presented with undeniable proof of their own defeat will always attempt to override reality with sheer volume. He crumpled the edge of the paper in his fist. "That is impossible," my father barked, projecting his voice so the surrounding investors could hear him assert his dominance. "I have been collecting the revenue from those leases for 2 years. The deposits go straight into my corporate accounts. I signed the tenant renewals myself. Do not tell me I do not own a building I manage every single day." I walked toward the center of the patio, my heels clicking rhythmically against the stone. The busboy had left the microphone resting on a tall cocktail table near the ice sculpture. I picked it up, flipped the power switch, and turned to face my father. "You have been collecting revenue that technically belonged to a blind trust," I corrected him, my voice carrying clean and sharp over the amplification system. I made sure every investor, every banker, and every golf partner heard the exact financial reality of his situation. "Your firm was never the owner." I continued pacing my words with the clinical precision of a certified public accountant. "Your firm was nothing more than a hired property manager. You collected the rents, extracted your meager 5% management fee, and remitted the net profits to a holding account. You assumed that holding account was a subsidiary of your own corporate umbrella. You never audited the chain of title. You just spent the money." My father opened his mouth to shout, but no sound materialized. He looked at Martin, seeking a lifeline, searching for a legal loophole he could exploit. Martin simply stared at the ground, shaking his head. "And here is the reality of your accounting error, Dad," I said, holding the microphone steady. Per Clause 4 of the Trust Framework. Now that the female heirs are confirmed, the trust formally separates from your management firm. But it goes further than a simple termination of services. The trust requires full repayment of all misallocated funds. I watched the realization spread through the crowd. Men holding crystal glasses of scotch suddenly stood a little straighter. The regional banking executives who had authorized my father's recent commercial loans exchanged sharp, panicked glances. They understood the math I was laying out before my father even processed it. For 2 years, you treated that restricted holding account as your personal slush fund, I explained to the silent audience. You commingled protected trust dividends with your own operating capital. You used that money to finance Chase's failing downtown developments. You owe my daughters $5 million in back rent, Dad. My father dropped the crumpled legal documents onto the patio table. His hands began to shake. I do not have $5 million in liquid cash, he muttered, his voice stripping away the bombastic bravado, leaving behind the hollow tone of a cornered man. You know that is tied up in construction. I do know that I replied, my tone dropping to a cold whisper that echoed through the speakers, which is why Grandpa Harrison included the penalty provision. If you cannot furnish the stolen $5 million within 30 days, the trust seizes your company to cover the debt. The patio erupted into a chaotic murmur. Wives gasped, pulling their cardigans tighter around their shoulders. The corporate lawyers scrambled toward Martin, bombarding him with frantic questions about asset liability. The investors, the men my father had invited to witness his crowning glory, began pulling out their phones. They were calculating their own exposure to my father's imminent insolvency. By pledging the Newport Beach complex as collateral for his recent loans, my father had committed bank fraud. The men on the patio realized they were standing next to a sinking ship and they were preparing to cut their ties. Chase could not handle the humiliation. He had spent his entire life coasting on unearned privilege, shielded from consequence by my father's checkbook. Hearing that his future empire was being legally repossessed by his pregnant sister broke his fragile composure. Chase lunged forward, shoving his way past a group of stunned guests. His face was a twisted mask of rage. He raised his arm, pointing a trembling finger at my face. Liam instantly stepped between us, planting his feet firmly on the stone pavers, his shoulders squared to absorb any physical impact. Liam did not raise his voice. He simply locked eyes with my brother, daring him to take one more step. Chase stopped, opting to throw his tantrum from a safe distance. "You manipulated a dying old man!" Chase screamed, the veins bulging against his stiff white collar. Saliva flew from his lips. "You went to his house when he was sick and you fed him lies. You stole our legacy because you are jealous. You are a thief." I stepped around Liam. I did not need my husband to fight this battle. I wanted Chase to look directly at the woman he had dismissed as a secretary. "No." "Chase," I said, staring my brother dead in the eye. I lowered the microphone, speaking just loud enough for him and my father to hear the unvarnished truth. I did not have to feed him a single lie. I just had to leave him alone with his own observations. Chase gritted his teeth, his chest heaving under his tailored suit. "Grandpa saw exactly who you were." I continued, holding my ground. "He watched you fail basic accounting. He watched you take credit for his lifelong labor. But more importantly, he watched how you both treated the women in this family. He listened to the degrading jokes. He saw the disrespect. He knew you viewed women as property, as objects meant to be managed or discarded." My father stood frozen behind Chase, listening to the post-mortem of his character, delivered in the bright afternoon sunlight. The pink confetti continued to drift across the patio, sticking to their expensive leather shoes, a persistent reminder of their defeat. Grandpa Harrison was a builder, I told them. He refused to let you demolish his life's work, so he made sure the one thing keeping your fragile little empire afloat belonged entirely to the demographic you despise. I let the poetic justice of the situation settle over them. The men who believed wealth was intrinsically tied to masculinity were now legally indentured to 2 unborn girls. Every luxury car Chase drove, every country club fee my father paid, had been funded by money that belonged to my daughters. They had spent years mocking my independence, unaware that my bloodline was their landlord. "You do not have a legacy, Chase," I said, my voice dripping with finality. "You have 30 days to vacate my daughter's property." Chase opened his mouth to scream another insult, but the sound died in his throat. He looked around the patio, seeking an ally. He looked at the investors he had golfed with the previous weekend. They turned their backs, pretending to be deeply engaged in quiet conversations. He looked at the regional bankers. They were already walking toward the valet stand, eager to distance their portfolios from our family name. My brother looked at my mother, who was still hiding near the ice sculpture. She kept her eyes glued to the stone pavers, refusing to intervene, refusing to offer comfort. She had spent 40 years avoiding the collateral damage of my father's ego, and she was not going to step into the blast radius today. Finally, Chase looked at my father. The golden child turned to the patriarch, waiting for a command, waiting for a strategy to fix the disaster. But my father had nothing to offer. He stared blankly at the crumpled trust documents resting on the cocktail table. His breathing was ragged. His empire, the kingdom he had ruled with an iron fist, was unraveling in real time. He could not yell his way out of a legally binding state-authenticated trust. He could not intimidate a financial institution into returning stolen capital. I turned off the microphone and set it down on a nearby chair. I reached down and picked up my woven maternity bag. I did not wait for a rebuttal. I did not linger to watch them process the devastation. I had delivered the paperwork, and my job was finished. I linked my arm through Liam's. We turned our backs on my father and brother. We walked across the patio, navigating through the sea of silent, stunned guests. No one tried to stop us. No one offered a parting word. The crowd parted respectfully, recognizing the shift in power. As we walked through the heavy oak doors of the country club and into the cool, air-conditioned lobby, the muffled sounds of chaos began to erupt behind us on the terrace. I heard Martin shouting frantically at my father. I heard the frantic clicking of heels as wives rushed to follow their husbands toward the exit. I heard the unmistakable sound of a dynasty collapsing under the weight of its own hubris. I stepped out into the circular driveway, the California sun warming my skin. The valet brought our sensible sedan around to the front. Liam opened the passenger door for me, a quiet, proud smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I rested my hand on my stomach, feeling a sudden sharp kick against my ribs. I smiled back at my husband. The financial guillotine had fallen. The trap had executed flawlessly. But the real consequences for my father and brother were just beginning. The legal and social fallout waiting for them on Monday morning would be far worse than a ruined baby shower. The financial fallout was spectacular, and it was entirely bound by the letter of the law. The regional banking executives who attended my baby shower did not wait for normal business hours to protect their interests. They made their phone calls from the plush leather seats of their luxury sedans on the drive home from the country club. By the time the sun rose over Orange County on Monday morning, an unstoppable fiscal avalanche had already begun. As a certified public accountant, I understand the precise, unforgiving mechanics of corporate debt. My father had utilized a strategy known as cross-collateralization. He had pledged the flagship Newport Beach complex against several different commercial loans to fund my brother Chase's high-risk downtown development projects. Commercial lending agreements contain strict acceleration clauses. This means if a borrower is found to have misrepresented a core asset, or if one foundational loan is deemed fraudulent, every single loan tied to that entity is immediately called due in full. When the lenders verified the legal title and realized the deed was securely locked inside a generation-skipping trust, they triggered those acceleration clauses without hesitation. The illusion my father spent 2 years curating shattered in a matter of days. Construction crews working on Chase's vanity projects were abruptly told to pack up their tools. Unfinished drywall and exposed steel beams were left abandoned in the middle of the city. The primary lending institution froze the firm's corporate operating accounts to secure whatever capital remained. I imagined my father arriving at his sleek executive suite expecting to rule his kingdom only to find his keycard access to the banking portal permanently denied. The payroll accounts bounced. Vendor invoices went unpaid. My father tried to call the same regional directors he had golfed with just 48 hours prior. Their receptionist sent him straight to voicemail. His money evaporated into thin air. A narcissist facing total ruin does not reflect on their own mistakes. They look for a target. They seek someone else to blame for their downfall. 10 days after the baby shower, a process server knocked on the front door of my home. I was in my 3rd trimester wearing comfortable lounge clothes and holding a mug of decaf tea. The The server handed me a thick stack of court documents. My father was suing me. The charge was elder abuse and undue influence. My father alleged that I had isolated a dying, confused old man. He claimed I used my accounting background to coerce my grandfather into signing away the family legacy. He petitioned the court to invalidate the trust, seize the $5 million in restricted dividends, and return the Newport Beach property to his firm. He wanted to tie me up in endless litigation, hoping the stress of a massive lawsuit would break me before I gave birth. Liam read the summons over my shoulder, his jaw setting into a hard, rigid line. He offered to drive to my father's office and handle the situation himself. I placed my hand on his chest, feeling the steady thumping of his heart, and told him to let the legal system do its job. I did not panic. I simply picked up my phone and called Mr. Davis. The seasoned estate attorney actually chuckled over the phone. It was a rare, dry sound from a man made of stone. He told me to wear something professional and meet him at the county courthouse on Thursday morning. We were going straight to the judge's chambers. The county courthouse was a sprawling building of gray stone and heavy oak doors. The judge assigned to our emergency injunction hearing was a no-nonsense woman with decades of experience in probate litigation. She did not tolerate frivolous lawsuits. My father sat across from me at the large conference table inside her chambers. He looked visibly aged. His tailored suit hung loosely on his shoulders. The stress of impending bankruptcy was carving deep, permanent lines into his face. He glared at me with a hostility that would have terrified me a decade ago. Today, it just looked pathetic. His hired litigator spoke first. The lawyer spun a tragic theatrical tale of a devoted son robbed by a scheming, manipulative daughter. He argued that Grandpa Harrison lacked the mental capacity to execute a complex legal maneuver in his final months. He demanded an immediate freeze on the trust assets, pending a full psychiatric review of my grandfather's medical history. Mr. Davis did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply opened his leather briefcase and extracted a secure digital tablet. He handed the tablet to the judge's clerk and explained that Grandpa Harrison anticipated this exact desperate legal maneuver. My grandfather knew his son would try to claim mental incompetence. To preempt this, Mr. Davis had arranged for a specialized video deposition on the very day the trust was signed. The clerk connected the tablet to the large monitor mounted on the chamber wall. The judge pressed play. The screen flickered to life. Grandpa Harrison sat in his study, propped up in his medical bed. He looked physically frail, but his eyes were sharp as cut glass. He held up that morning's daily newspaper to verify the exact date. A licensed medical professional sat beside him stating her credentials on the record and formally confirming his total cognitive lucidity. Then my grandfather looked directly into the camera lens. His breathing was labored, but the authority in his voice commanded the silent room. "I am recording this statement of my own free will," Grandpa Harrison rasped, staring through the screen. "I am placing the Newport Beach complex and all its subsequent revenue into a blind trust for Mia's future daughters. I am doing this because my son is a misogynist fool." My father flinched in his chair as if he had been physically struck. He stared at the monitor, his mouth falling open. "My son runs my company like a private piggy bank." My grandfather continued, his voice dripping with unmistakable disdain. "He is blinded by his own toxic pride. He elevates a grandson who lacks basic competence while ignoring a granddaughter who possesses genuine brilliance. I leave this property to Mia because she actually knows the value of hard work. Any attempt by my son to contest this trust is the final act of a desperate, incompetent man trying to steal what he could never build himself." The video ended. The screen faded to black. The silence inside the judge's chambers was lethal. My father stared at the blank monitor. The last shred of his unearned dignity had just been stripped away by the very man whose legacy he claimed to embody. He could not blame me. He could not blame a clerical error. He had just been judged, convicted, and sentenced by his own father from beyond the grave. The judge turned to my father's lawyer. Her expression radiated sheer, unfiltered contempt. She did not even ask for closing arguments. She struck her gavel against the wooden block. She dismissed my father's case with prejudice. That specific legal terminology meant my father was permanently barred from ever bringing this claim to court again. The ruling was final. The legal door slammed shut, sealing his fate forever. The subsequent collapse of the family company happened with breathtaking speed. Without the Newport property to borrow against, the firm could not restructure its massive debt. They could not meet their payroll obligations. The board of directors held an emergency vote and forced the company into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The court appointed an independent trustee to liquidate the remaining assets and pay off the furious creditors. Chase's lavish lifestyle shattered overnight. He had spent his adult life charging expensive dinners, luxury vacations, and designer clothes to the corporate card. The moment the credit lines were cut, the illusion of his success evaporated. His wife, a woman who had married the projection of $1 billion real estate portfolio, suddenly realized she was tethered to a sinking ship. She was accustomed to private galas and exclusive charity events, not relentless creditor phone calls and slashed spending limits. She realized Chase possessed no actual skills to generate income on his own. She packed her expensive designer luggage on a Tuesday afternoon. Chase came home to an empty luxury penthouse. He found a divorce petition sitting on the kitchen island next to a stack of past due notices. The golden child, stripped of the financial shield our father had provided, was left with nothing but his own sheer incompetence. He was forced to move into a cheap apartment, begging former business contacts for entry-level sales positions just to keep the lights on. My father experienced a much darker, much quieter ruin. Wealth in Orange County operates like an exclusive, ruthless club. Once the money dries up, the invitations cease. The men who used to laugh at his jokes suddenly cross the street to avoid him. His presence became a liability. Desperate to maintain the illusion of control, my father attempted to visit his prestigious country club for a Sunday brunch. He put on his best tailored suit, parked his leased car in the lot, and walked into the grand lobby, holding his head high. The membership director intercepted him before he could even reach the dining room. The director pulled him aside, discreetly speaking in hushed, polite tones that carried the weight of a death sentence. The director informed my father that his membership dues were severely delinquent. Furthermore, the board had taken a vote regarding the recent negative publicity surrounding his bankruptcy fraud. They asked him to quietly clear out his golf locker and surrender his membership card. It was the ultimate crushing humiliation for a man who worshipped social status above all else. He was escorted off the property by a junior staff member. Stripped of his company, expelled from his club, and drained of his unearned pride, my father was forced to face his creditors. He had to sell his sprawling estate in the hills just to avoid facing criminal fraud charges for pledging assets he did not own. The proceeds from the house sale barely covered his outstanding debts. He downsized drastically. He packed whatever belongings fit into a moving truck and relocated to a small generic condo in a dusty, landlocked town 2 hours away from the coast. It was a place where nobody knew his name. It was a place where nobody cared about his fabricated legacy. He traded a kingdom built on misogyny for a tiny living room where he could sit in silence, surrounded by the consequences of his own arrogance. 3 months ago, the sterile quiet of a hospital delivery room wrapped around Liam and me like a protective shield. The steady, rhythmic beeping of the fetal monitors marked the final moments of a long, exhausting journey. Liam stood by my side, gripping my hand, his face pale, but etched with unwavering devotion. When the doctor finally instructed me to push, the outside world ceased to exist. Maya arrived first, announcing her presence with a strong, demanding cry that echoed off the tiled walls. Minutes later, Chloe followed, smaller but equally vibrant, her tiny fingers grasping at the air. When the nurses placed my 2 daughters on my chest, a profound, grounding warmth washed over me. I looked down at their fragile faces, breathing in the clean, distinct scent of newborn life. I felt the physical weight of the future resting against my skin. At that exact moment, 2 hours north in a dusty, landlocked town, my father was waking up in a cramped condominium, stripped of his wealth and his audience. He was waking up to a reality he had built with his own arrogance. I was waking up to a reality I had secured with patience. The hospital administration brought in the standard birth registration forms and visitor clearance logs. The nurse handed me a clipboard and a pen. She asked if I wanted to notify the front desk to expect extended family. I looked at Liam. He offered a gentle, confirming nod. I took the pen and drew a single dark line through the visitor section. We did not send birth announcements to my father. We did not mail a card to my brother Chase's cheap apartment. We did not post photos on social media for extended relatives to gossip over. I severed the flow of information entirely. Depriving toxic individuals of access to your joy is the ultimate boundary. My daughters were not going to be introduced to men who viewed their gender as a corporate liability. They would never learn to shrink themselves to accommodate a fragile patriarchal ego. They would only know a home where their voices held power. This strict boundary birthed a new, quiet conflict regarding my mother. For weeks after the girls were born, my phone remained silent. Then, a hesitant, tentative voicemail appeared on my machine. It was my mother. Her voice lacked the practiced high society polish she had worn for 4 decades. She sounded tired. She asked if she could meet her grandchildren. Liam and I discussed the risks. My mother had enabled my father's behavior for my entire life. But isolation can either destroy a person or force an awakening. We agreed to a supervised visit on neutral ground. My mother drove herself to our house on a Tuesday afternoon. When she stepped out of her modest sedan, the visual transformation was striking. The heavy designer jewelry was gone. The rigid sprayed hairstyle had fallen into a softer, natural shape. She looked older, yet somehow unburdened. She had initiated a formal legal separation from my father, refusing to follow him into the desolate exile he had created. She moved into a small townhouse, living off a modest pension she had secured before their marriage. She walked into my living room and hesitated near the sofa, unsure of where to place her hands. I introduced her to Maya and Chloe. When she picked up Maya, her hands began to tremble. A solitary tear tracked down her cheek, falling onto the baby's swaddle. We sat across from each other drinking herbal tea. The silence between us was heavy with unsaid apologies. Finally, she looked up from her cup. She confessed that watching the corporate empire crumble had shattered the illusion she had worshipped her whole adult life. She admitted that her husband's supposed protection was never a shield. It was a cage. He had funded her lifestyle in exchange for her voice, her agency, and her courage. She traded her moral compass for a country club membership, and it cost her the respect of her only capable child. I did not offer her immediate forgiveness. Trust is not a gift. It is a structure built over time. I told her she was welcome to visit the girls, but only under our roof and only if she continued to dismantle the learned helplessness she had hidden behind for so long. She nodded, accepting the terms without argument. The power dynamic had permanently shifted. She was no longer dictating family rules from a granite kitchen island. She was a guest in a home governed by mutual respect. While my personal life settled into a harmonious rhythm, the professional landscape required my immediate attention. The financial void left by my father's bankruptcy had to be managed. The flagship Newport Beach property needed steady leadership to reassure its high-value tenants. I did not hire an external property management firm. I expanded my own accounting business. I leased a sleek, modern commercial space and hired a dedicated team of real estate attorneys and portfolio managers. We took direct operational control of the Newport complex. I transitioned from an independent tax consultant to the managing director of a commercial hub. The transition presented a satisfying, unexpected challenge. 2 months after I took over the regional director of a major national bank, whose branch anchored the Newport property, requested an urgent meeting. This man had been a close golf associate of my father. He assumed the recent bankruptcy scandal meant the new management would be desperate for stability. He thought he could bully a young female trustee into a highly unfavorable lease renewal. He walked into my new conference room wearing a custom suit projecting the same arrogant swagger my father used to weaponize. He sat across the glass table, spread his hands, and offered a lease extension that slashed his rent by 20%. He claimed the market was softening and hinted that he was doing me a favor by keeping his branch in my building. He expected me to panic. He expected me to yield to his perceived authority. I opened my laptop. I projected a comprehensive market analysis onto the screen behind me. I did not raise my voice. I walked him through the precise foot traffic metrics of the plaza, the upward trajectory of local commercial valuations, and the zoning restrictions that made relocating his branch mathematically disastrous for his bank. I showed him the exact profit margins his branch enjoyed due to my grandfather's prime location. I presented a counteroffer raising his rent by 8%, accurately reflecting the current market value. "I am not my father," I told the executive, maintaining steady eye contact. "I do not operate on golf course handshakes or intimidation. I operate on data. You can sign the renewal at market rate, or I can lease the space to your direct competitor who has already submitted a letter of intent." The executive stared at the projection screen, his confident posture dissolving. He recognized the ironclad logic of my presentation. He realized he was not dealing with a compliant secretary. He was dealing with a master of the ledger. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his pen, and signed the document without another word. The patriarchal system he relied upon bowed to undeniable competence. I did not destroy my father's legacy. His own hubris handled the demolition. Gravity and arrogance brought down his house of cards. I merely presented the paperwork to the people who mattered. The $5 million in stolen back rent was recovered during the bankruptcy liquidation. Because the generation-skipping trust held a secured priority claim against my father's fraudulent loans, my legal team extracted the funds directly from the sale of his personal estate and remaining commercial assets. The capital was deposited safely back into the trust. I did not spend the money on luxury cars or flashy vacations. I diversified the principal into low-risk index funds and municipal bonds. The core capital sits safely behind a legal firewall, steadily compounding to secure the future of Maya and Chloe. They will go to whatever university they choose. They will never have to depend on a man for their survival. The ongoing massive revenue generated by the Newport Beach property serves a different purpose. I directed a portion of the monthly net profit to establish a specialized educational foundation, the Harrison and Mia Trust Scholarship. It provides full tuition grants for young women from underprivileged backgrounds who are pursuing degrees in finance, accounting, and commercial real estate law. I am actively funding the exact demographic my father tried to suppress. Every quarter I sign checks that put brilliant, capable women into boardrooms across the country. I am building an army of women who know how to read a balance sheet, women who will never let an arrogant executive tell them that numbers are a man's game. It is the most satisfying return on investment I could ever imagine. If you are a woman listening to this story and you have ever been told you are less than because of your gender, I want you to internalize this lesson. When toxic people try to minimize your worth, do not waste your breath screaming. Screaming is exactly what they expect from you. It gives them permission to label you as unstable. Let them underestimate you. Let them talk over you at dinner tables. Let them assume you are not paying attention. Keep your head down, do the work, and cultivate your own independence. Build your own fortress. And most importantly, keep your receipts. Document the errors. Archive the betrayals. Understand the systems that govern the world around you. Because when the time comes to balance the scales, the truth does not need to yell to be heard. The truth is quiet. It is methodical. It just needs a flawless paper trail. Thank you for watching. If this journey of reclaiming power empowered you, please like and subscribe. Share your thoughts in the comments, and I will see you in the next one. I sit on my back patio tonight, the evening sun casting a warm golden hue over the lawn. The house is quiet. Maya and Chloe are asleep in their nursery, breathing softly, unaware of the patriarchal battles fought and won before they even took their first breaths. They will grow up knowing only their own strength. Looking back at the wreckage of my father's empire and the peaceful reality I now inhabit, the journey boils down to 5 distinct lessons I carry with me every single day. First, financial literacy is your strongest armor. When you understand the math, the contracts, and the legal systems that govern your world, no one can manipulate your reality. Money is a tool. Knowing how it works is your ultimate shield. Second, silence is a highly effective strategy. You do not have to announce your boundaries, argue your point, or justify your exit to toxic people. Do the groundwork in the background, and let your preparation do the talking when the moment arrives. Third, never interrupt arrogance. When individuals blinded by their own ego underestimate you, let them. Their unearned confidence will dig their own trap much faster than you ever could. You just have to stand back and wait for them to step into it. Fourth, a shared bloodline does not demand blind loyalty. A last name is not a license for disrespect. Walking away from a family member who views you as a subordinate or a liability is not a betrayal. It is a necessary act of self-preservation. Finally, a true legacy is not a birthright inherited through gender. It is not handed down in a corner office or secured by a country club membership. Real legacy is built through competence, unyielding integrity, and the doors you hold open for the people coming up behind you. My father spent his life trying to build a kingdom for a son who lacked the capacity to manage it. I built a fortress for daughters who will one day own it. I no longer carry the weight of my family's dismissal. The ledger is balanced, the accounts are securely settled, and the future belongs entirely to the women who know their own worth. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. If my story gave you the courage to examine the ledgers of your own life and cut the bad investments loose, please hit the like button and subscribe to Orange Revenge. Your support helps this channel bring more narratives of resilience and justice to light. Drop a comment below telling me which of those 5 lessons resonated with you the most. Stay sharp, guard your peace, and I will see you in the next video.